Hi, everyone. Good afternoon and good evening and good whatever part of the day it is, wherever you are in the world. I'm Tigress Osborne. I am the Director of Community Outreach for the National Association to Advance Fat Acceptance, otherwise known as NAAFA. Thank you for joining us for another of our 2020 webinar series. Today, we're going to be talking about changing anti-discrimination law in your local area to include weight as a category. And we have three very special guests with us today. I'm going to introduce them to you in just a second. Before I do that, just a couple of notes about NAAFA for those of you who might be new to us. NAAFA is a 51-year-old fat rights organization working towards bettering the lives of fat people, particularly in the United States, but wherever we can, anywhere currently on this planet, and anywhere in the universe whenever we can. We do that through advocacy and through education and through representation. And to learn more about us, you can go to our website, naafa.org. You can find us on social media, on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter. And we host this webinar series at least once a month, often more than that. And we make these webinars available on YouTube and also on our website. So if you have not seen, if this is your first webinar with us, we encourage you to take a look at some of the others that are available for your viewing free. These webinars are free and open to the community, and that is done through contributions of our members and other generous sponsors. If you're interested in helping support that, you can make donations through naafa.org. We are still working on the calendar for our upcoming webinars, so we have lots of things that we're very excited to share with you, but they are all still tentative at this point, so I will not mention specifics. But you can always find details about our upcoming webinars in our NAAFA newsletter, which is also free and supported by member contributions. You can sign up for that newsletter at our website as well. So our thanks to the NAAFA board for supporting the webinar series and to our members and contributors for helping make this possible today. I would like to introduce you to our three special guests today. We are going to be hearing from three folks who have contributed to helping make it illegal to discriminate against people based on body size. First, we're going to hear from Dany Atkins. Dany is an activist, journalist, anthropologist, and author. She co-founded the Body Image Task Force in Santa Cruz, California, along with her mother, Mary Atkins. The two worked with other activists to push the National Organization of Women, to adopt size acceptance as part of their platform, and Dany's going to tell you a little bit about that. In addition to working as the director and chair of the BITF, Dany joined NAAFA and served as the research chair for several years. In the early 1990s, she worked with then Santa Cruz Mayor Neil Coonerty to propose adding height, weight, and personal appearance to the city's anti-discrimination ordinance. They were ultimately able to pass a more comprehensive anti-discrimination ordinance that set precedent on several levels, as well as adding sexual orientation, gender identity, height, weight, and personal appearance. Dany was instrumental in helping others as they added protections in San Francisco and Iowa City, Iowa, where she had moved to join the PhD program in feminist anthropology at the University of Iowa. Her dissertation research focused on body image and sexuality among transgender people. Dany Atkins is currently working on a second round of research and plans to publish a longitudinal work of transgender lives. Then we'll be hearing from Carole Cullum. Carole has been politically active throughout her life. In the 60s and 70s, she worked to stop the Vietnam War and demonstrated in the May Day actions, if they won't stop the war, we'll stop the government, in Washington, D.C. She has been an advocate for women's rights, working for Congresswoman Bella Abzug and helping with the National Women's Conference. Carole worked for Senate campaigns. She worked for the first alcoholism center for lesbians funded by the US government, and she helped found Ocean Park Community Organization in Santa Monica, California. After attending law school, Carole became a family law specialist. She joined the Alice B. Toklas LGBT Democratic Club and served as co-president. Carole was appointed by Mayor Willie Brown to the Board of Permit Appeals in San Francisco. She joined NAAFA and served as president for several years. In San Francisco, Carole joined Marilyn Wan and other fat activists in a series of actions against a fitness company's billboard. Some of you will remember this action that stated, "When the aliens come, they will eat the fat ones first." This is part of why I said we defend fat rights all over the universe. This important and colorful demonstration was the first step towards the passage of San Francisco's ordinance that bans discrimination based on weight and height. And then finally, we will hear from Dr. Sean Massey, who is an associate professor of women, gender, and sexuality studies at Binghamton University. He received his PhD in social personality psychology from the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. His research focuses on the study of sexuality, gender, anti-LGBTQ prejudice, attitudes towards same-sex parenting, racial bias in educational and law enforcement contexts, and the relationship between social science and social change. He is co-investigator in the Binghamton University Human Sexualities Lab. Dr. Massey also served on the Binghamton City Council from 2008 to 2011, where he co-authored legislation establishing Binghamton Human Rights Commission and the Binghamton Human Rights Law, which banned discrimination based on gender expression, height, and weight in employment, housing, and public accommodation. He served as the chair of the Binghamton Human Rights Commission from 2012 to 2015. Thank you, all three of you, wonderful and instrumental for human rights, human beings, for being with us today. I want to give you a round of applause because even just reading that has me feeling super emotional, just reading your biographies and sharing that piece of your history with our audience. I'd like to start with Dany. And Dany, we're just going to ask you to just tell us your story of the work that you did with NOW in terms of size acceptance, and then how that led to the work that you did in the city of Santa Cruz.
Little known fact that you might find interesting is that NAAFA and NOW were both founded in the same year. So the size acceptance movement and the feminist movement were essentially on the same path in many ways. Mary and I joined, Mary was my mother, Mary Atkins, and I joined NOW in the 70s. And when we moved to Santa Cruz in 1986, we were part of a new chapter that started there. And it's in 1987 where body image comes into our lives, starting with work I was doing in anthropology, but also because of the State Now conference in which I went to a size acceptance, learn about fat discrimination workshop. And that's when things really started moving in NOW at that time around this. I want to share that photo. I have a photo from the national conference for the National Organization for Women. And the woman behind the table in purple colors there is my mother, Mary. And the woman behind her is me, little old girl in green. And I was fairly aggressive at that moment. I remember the people were laughing because we were putting pins on, or banners. I don't remember what they were, some sort of thing you had to wear on your shirt if you were for the anti-discrimination resolution. And nobody got past me without getting one on.
Excellent.
Yeah. And that's it.
What year is this, Dany? This is 1987?
1987. And we won, and there was a huge cheer in the audience when it passed. I think people were pretty excited. Meanwhile, we started a body image task force, which originally was a division of Santa Cruz Now. But body image task force ended up gaining more members than Now itself at that time, and there was a conflict with a few the members of the board who were not, shall we say, understanding the importance of anti-discrimination for fat people. And so we split off separately and became our own organization. And it was in that role that I ended up becoming involved in local politics. We, at one of the early pre-election town halls that were held for the people who were running for city council, we put on the list that every one of them had to answer what would they support an ordinance that would ban size discrimination. And then we followed up after the elections. Well, Neil Coonerty was one of the ones who was, hell yeah. And we actually helped a bit in his campaign, those of us individually wanted to. And I gave him a few months after he got into office, and then showed up at his door, at his office going, okay, it's time to do it. And he's like, okay, how do we do it? And I had done what research I could already on the places where there was ordinances that would cover it. And I pulled from, I think it was state back then. It was the only state that had it, my memory. And Washington, D.C., which had the personal appearance aspect covered. And we put them together, and with the help of the city council's attorney, send in an ordinance. And we're shocked when it kind of blew up in our faces. There are cameras from all over the world. It was very weird. What had started out as a small city council meeting in which we expected no problems, sort of snowballed with several things that happened internationally at the time. One of those was California had passed a statewide acceptance of sexual orientation as one of the protected categories, but the then Governor Wilson vetoed it. There were riots in San Francisco. I remember there's a cop car overturned, all this sort of stuff. So we had to sort of backpedal and revise our ordinance to be more inclusive. And that's when we added sexual orientation, gender, height, weight, and personal appearance. So we weren't prepared for what was to be a small city council meeting, got moved to a huge auditorium and was full of people. And that's when we formed a coalition at that point. There was a whole bunch of us from different organizations throughout Santa Cruz that were working on not just adding categories, but looking at the way the law was written for a city. For instance, state law says you can, if you have 15 or less than 15 employees, the ordinance didn't apply to you. And we thought, Santa Cruz, most stores don't have that many employees. So we changed it to 5. And that one was actually, in some ways, the more long-reaching of the changes we made, but there were several others we made as well. We, for instance, took out the exemption for religion unless it was for clergy. So, you know, we weren't going to take on the Roman Catholic Church, but we did make it so that there were several thrift stores, for instance, they got into trouble because they couldn't discriminate against their employees there. So for secular positions, we didn't see any reason they should be allowed to discriminate. And we hit a huge riot, and this will be important, of confluence of things going on. And they tried to actually divide the ordinance back again at that moment, because the city councilors say, oh, we'll pass the sexual orientation stuff and we'll leave the rest. And I'm like, no way. We're not doing this. And luckily the coalition stood behind us. There were some people who were angry about that, but Wendy Chapkus was one of the LGBT leaders who was there, and she stood firm with us that we weren't going to divide the ordinance. So we ended up back in rewriting phase for a bit, and we passed it very soon after. But we could talk about some of the guerrilla tactics we got to get the Chamber of Commerce to back off from opposing it. And the final wording was sexual orientation, gender identity, height, weight, and physical appearance, which was a loss in some areas. But it covers anything from birth, accident, or natural development. So they didn't want to cover purple hair. I'm like, this is Santa Cruz, who would care? But the reason we'd put in the personal appearance stuff, the reason it was important, we're seeing now still with Black Lives Movement, which is the reason DC had it, was to protect, for instance, African hairstyles, African American hairstyles. And so we lost a bit there. But I later learned, after years of coming back to this and seeing what's going on, that we were written up in several of the law journals as one of the most all-encompassing ordinances of the time. And
Wow.
that's where we got it, and it's still in use. And I still get people telling me, "Oh yeah, I got to go against my employer because they tried to make me lose weight, and we won." Things like that.
So you do get to hear from people about the ways that this ordinance affected their lives.
Yes, that's been fun. It's been fun when it's an accident, when somebody starts talking about, "Oh yeah, you were from Santa Cruz. Well, this, you wouldn't believe what happened to me in Santa Cruz," and they start talking about that, and I'm like, "Yeah, I'd believe it." It's one of those. Uh, one of my favorite moments in Santa Cruz.
That's fantastic. Well, thank you for that synopsis. I think we'll hear everyone else's synopsis before we get. I think we're probably going to go back to what you said about those guerrilla tactics, but
Yep.
let's hear everybody else's synopsis before we do that. Thank you so much, Dany. I just want to note that one of our participants did point out in the chat. Made a note to me in the chat about pronoun use. I normally introduce myself and include my pronouns, and I didn't do that. So I will say, for those who are watching, my pronouns are she, her. And Dany, I know when we read the people who are seeing the recording may not be able to see that you have indicated 2 sets of pronouns here, but I only read one of them in your bio because you used one in your bio. Do you want to say anything about that?
I mostly didn't. Let's see. I would say I'm gender collaged at this moment rather than gender flexible. So I usually accept any gender pronoun at this point.
Okay. And so the bios that I read are bios that were given to us by our guests themselves. So the pronouns that they have used in their bios are the pronouns they have that they use. And so I will allow them to say anything more that they want to about their pronoun use, but I didn't identify myself that way. So Dany, I just wanted to give you that chance too. Okay, let's go on to Carole. Let's hear about your experience in San Francisco.
Okay, I'll start out with this. How am I going to do? Oh, here it is.
Hit the button.
There it is.
So Carol's going to bring up an image for us to start out with.
Can you all see it?
I remember that.
Yes.
Okay, this billboard came out in February of 1999, and Marilyn Wan saw that, and some other people, and said, this is not right. So she started a demonstration, and we had about 30-some people there, and we did it week after week after week, until they finally took the, when they come, they'll eat the fat ones first, until they took it down. It got a lot of press coverage, and Tom Amiano, who was a supervisor in San Francisco, saw it and got in touch with us to arrange a hearing with the City Human Rights Commission. So for 3 months, because we did our work beforehand, our core group, which was Marilyn Wan, Sandra Soloway, Francis White, Joe Cuny, and I, we did our research. We contacted other states and cities. We contacted people who were on the board, who were in the Human Rights Commission, people who knew about them, to try and figure out what was the best way to approach them. And so on June 10th, we went before the Human Rights Commission, and each person spoke up and had 7 minutes to speak. Marilyn, who's here today, spoke about debunking the weight loss myth. And different people spoke about other issues. And one of the people who spoke was a pediatrician named Dr. Kelly, who is on the San Francisco School Board. And he sent a letter to the commission supporting the proposed law, citing the impact our cultural obsession with fitness has on kids. And kids, people of all different ages came and spoke for this. Nobody spoke against it, which was really wonderful. And the hearing took about an hour, and the commissioners had a vote, and they unanimously approved sending the request to the Board of Supervisors. So before we brought it to the Board of Supervisors, let me get rid of this. Before we took it to the Board of Supervisors, we had to figure out who was going to speak to each of the board members. And there were, I think, about nine different members. And so we got together and we figured who would be the best person for this person to talk to them. And I talked to one of the most conservative people on the board, a woman who was kind of short and probably in her 50s. And she'd always been quite nice to me, but aloof. I went in and spoke to her, and I spoke about my own personal experience. And that's what everybody did, is talked about their own personal experience. And then I invited her to speak, to say, you know, what other kinds of experiences she had personally or in her family or friends. And it turns out that her brother was very fat, and she started crying over all of the things that he had to go through. And it was right there that I was able to make that connection for her. So she understood it. She understood it right then and there. And not only did she agree to vote for it, but she agreed to talk to all the other members, which was very good because she was considered the problem child. And she was wonderful. And we were able to use those 3 weeks to get the people together and get our votes together, so that when we walked in, we had no opposition. We placed it before the board. People spoke up about it. They had a lot of people who spoke for it. I think there was one person who spoke against it, and he was so weird that it didn't matter. But it was, again, it was unanimously approved. And it has changed how San Francisco deals with height and weight discrimination. And I am so pleased that we did that.
Thank you, Carole. Now we'll have Sean go ahead and give us your rundown, please, and then we'll start doing some comparisons and taking some questions.
Okay, great. So one, thank you for inviting me to participate in this. It was a while ago when we passed this legislation, and I realize now that it's a lot longer for some of the rest of you, but it was quite an amazing time in Binghamton when this legislation actually passed. Let me just say that a little bit about me. I grew up in Central Texas and spent much of my childhood in either Austin or a rural community in the hill country of Texas. But like most queer kids, me and together with my later to-be husband, we immigrated to New York City in the late 80s, right in the middle of the AIDS crisis, and we became part of an organization called Gay Men's Health Crisis, and where we gained more than a little bit of experience with some of the challenges of interacting with the healthcare industry. My research has focused primarily on the psychology of prejudice in grad school, and as Tigris mentioned, I served for 4 years on the Binghamton, New York City Council, and also as part of the Human Rights Commission. Now, to be honest, the initial motivation to establish a local human rights law in Binghamton came from a number of transgender constituents who had spoken to me about the lack of protections for trans individuals in the city of Binghamton and in New York State in general. The Gender Equality Non-Discrimination Act, or GENDA, had failed to pass in the New York State Senate. And we realized it was unlikely to become law anytime soon at that point. It has since become law, but at that point it was unlikely to pass. And I was a newly elected member of City Council with a fairly liberal set of colleagues who were all Democratic on council, and a progressive mayor. Both the mayor and I had been endorsed by Working Families Party at the time. And we felt like there was a possibility that we could get a human rights law passed locally. So I did research on this. I didn't know anything about how to, write a human rights law. So I reached out to the National Lesbian Gay Task Force and spoke to Lisa Mattet, who was part of that organization. And Lisa helped me find model legislation that included protections based on gender expression and identity. But we both agreed that since we were creating a new law, we might as well try to make it as comprehensive as possible. And Lisa suggested that we consider including size protections in the law. I had been made aware of the injustice surrounding weight discrimination in graduate school after reading the work of social psychologists like Chris Crandall, who studied fat prejudice and actually published quite a bit of work in mainstream literature on that in social psychology. So we reached out and got assistance from the NYCLU, the New York State Division on Human Rights, and fat activists and researchers, Marilyn Wan, and also Sandra Solovey, who is on the call. Hi, Sandra. And so, so we put all that together. We basically drafted this law. It included physical size, and that law passed in 2008. The council vote was unanimous, and the mayor enthusiastically signed the legislation into law. But one challenge we had to address was that New York State Division of Human Rights only advocates for protections covered by New York State human rights law. And this was a local law and not statewide. So at the time, our addition of gender expression and size protections were still not something that could be brought before the division. So who was going to really advocate for any of this? And so we also then decided to create the Binghamton Human Rights Commission as a body that could, among other things, promote and advocate on behalf of the additional protections that were part of the human rights law. Initially, the draft language, by the way, that when we were trying to pass it, included protections against discrimination based on, quote, physical characteristics. We tried to use the most expansive language. But I think, Dany, you mentioned that this created some challenges. Our corporation counsel, who was actually not really in support of doing this at all, he found this language to be too broad and therefore difficult to enforce and all that. So we compromised on physical size, which we defined as weight and height. And so we passed it. The organizations that supported us, were critical in figuring out how to do this. And I think one of the things that's really, really important is that, building a coalition of support from progressive, organizations was really key to doing this. In our case, I think it was absolutely critical that folks like Lisa Mattet at the National Lesbian and Gay Task Force was ready to guide me to a more expansive effort guide me from where I initially started to a more expansive effort. So this networking and coalition building, I think, among progressive and human rights organizations is really, really critical. So that's our story. I have one image to show too as well. So part of what we needed to do once we passed the law was let people know that we'd done it, because unlike California, we can pass these laws in this little city council without really involving the actual people that are out there in the community, and maybe, I think that there's some really good things and bad things about that. So let me just show you one of the efforts that our Human Rights Commission did to start to advocate for this. It was a poster campaign that we did to, hold on one second, bear with me. We did a poster campaign for all of the different protections in our Human Rights Commission, our human rights law, that we then flyered the community with. And Catherine was one of the folks who volunteered her image to be on our posters. We had quite a few other folks as well who were, I'll just show you a couple of the other ones real quick. These were some of our other protections that we offered. So there you go.
Thank you, Sean. So I will ask a couple of questions to our panelists, while those of you who are in the chat and may have questions can get your questions ready and start entering some questions there. And so that'll give you all a few minutes to type some questions in there if you have them. First of all, I'm wondering if you all think that these laws are most useful, or how you think the comparison is between the way these laws are useful for people who have been discriminated against versus the way that they are useful in preventing that discrimination from happening in the first place. Like, do you feel like people in the communities where you helped pass these regulations, ordinances, laws, whichever thing they are in the place that you did it, do you feel like it's widely known enough that it actually helps prevent some of that discrimination, or do you feel like it serves more as a way to have recourse when it happens anyway? Or is it a mixed bag?
Both. Definitely both. Yeah. I mean, we already had, I forgot to mention, there's so much going on in that story in Santa Cruz that just prior to all this, Tony Casista had tried to get a job in a local health food grocery store and been denied based on her weight. And so she already had that case that she was arguing. So we were able to point to an exact case right away in the town. And that sort of put a spotlight for people on what was going on. And Santa Cruz prides itself on being very egalitarian. And so to have it happen in their own community was a bigger deal than if it would have been just the statistics. Although I did come in, and don't forget, like their posters, image helps. I walked in, they said, why don't you give us a couple statistics? And I said, a couple. And I brought in a stack of books that was about like 2 or 3 feet high and put it on the podium. Which ones do I start with? And it was true. And I listed off several, but, to make the idea that, that this isn't even a debatable topic of whether it happens or not. What you need to decide is whether it's okay.
Right.
But our biggest obstacle was the city council. Not the city council, Chamber of Commerce, the businesses that didn't want to have to mess with it. So in the time between the first blow up and, we were working on with the lawyers on rewriting. You try being stuck in a room with 5 lawyers for a week who have to run to consensus. Oh my God, things I never knew I'd have to do. But the Chamber of Commerce was the one who were giving us trouble. So what we did is made our coalition of like, a dozen or more organizations, made up cards, look like business cards that said, I am your customer and I support the Santa Cruz Anti-Discrimination Ordinance. This is where your money comes from. And every time they went down shopping in Santa Cruz, they would hand out the card with their money. And that apparently made a big deal. We got commentary from the lawyer for the Chamber of Commerce that her clients were easing back a bit on their opposition. So, finding ways to show support for the ordinance for the people was important.
Right, I had a point.
Sure.
I would say that one of the things that we discovered as we were trying to push this is that, critical consciousness around size discrimination, fat prejudice is not widespread. And even among my, so-called progressive colleagues on council, we had to have long conversations about, health myths and things like that, I hadn't expected. And I mean, my own naivete, but it was important, I think, to, once we passed the law, once we had the posters up, the idea of kind of raising awareness about this within our local community was very important. Honestly, I can't say which, whether or not, it does, because of the way it's difficult to get a lot of information about tracking of who might have filed a claim.
Right.
And just one little bit of history, our majority that we have on council was replaced by a different majority on council. And the Human Rights Commission was disbanded by a new mayor. And so we actually don't have anybody able to, kind of advocate or track, claims. So we don't know entirely how much effect this has had on our local community. But the human rights law stands, and people know it's there. And I think advocacy around kind of informing people that it exists, both in terms of who might decide to discriminate, but also who might be the target of that and want to file a claim. I think it's both.
Thank you, Sean. Carole, did you have any thoughts on that question?
Your mic.
Carole, I think you're muted.
It's off.
Sorry.
There
We had issues with the Chamber of Commerce also. The way that we dealt with it is I was at the time, if I was the co-chair, I think I was a co-chair of Alice B. Toklas LGBT Democratic Club. It's the biggest Democratic club in San Francisco. It has ties to everybody, and especially in the Chamber of Commerce. So I went into the board and I said, okay, this is what you got to do. You all got to help us. And they did, and everybody on the board went and contacted people on the chamber, and they agreed to back off, which was amazing because they weren't wild about it. But they agreed not to, they wouldn't come out in favor of it, but they wouldn't oppose it. So that was great. Being involved with the Democratic Club was very, very good. It really opened up doors that would not otherwise have been opened.
I think that's actually important. A good transition to the next question that I had, which was, Sean also mentioned coalitions, and of course, Dany talked about having worked with NOW and how that led to some of this work. Are there other organizations? I mean, you've all mentioned individual people who were instrumental. Are there other organizations that any of you partnered with, or
Well,
would
yes.
partner with if you were going to do it again?
Yes. Well, it did help that Mary and I were already integrated in the community as activists. I think my mother was on 5 board of directors of women's organizations. She ended up later winning the Women's Commission Award for her work. And same with me. I don't know how many I was on. So between those, we knew a lot of people, and then we actively sought we got on the phone because we didn't have internet back then, and contacted every left organization in town. Mm-hmm. And because of some of the things we were doing, we would say, not only is this good for us, for the people we're advocating for, it's also good for you because we're increasing the number of businesses that you're covered under as well. Things like that. So like Sean said, it's having a coalition, I'd say, is one of the most important aspects of it.
One of the things that we did is when we were first talking with the Human Rights Commission on how to form this law, they were somewhat hesitant that it only dealt with discrimination based on size. So we got in touch with the Little People organization so that we have it size and weight, and yep. Bringing them in made it more acceptable, I guess.
Yeah, ours, per the physical characteristics, also covered things like, if you had a birth mark on your face, or you had scars from an injury, these sorts of things that weren't covered are covered under the physical characteristics. Right. I really think that if people are doing it now, they should look to try to be as inclusive of who needs to be covered, not just who you're advocating for, and look to other people to help you work on that.
I agree with that. Also, I'm going to put this out there, having a Democratic majority on council helped. I'm just putting.
Yes.
It just really did. And, so I would say that's a good way to get it done.
Go work in the election of who you want to be mayor.
Yeah, right.
So could you do this, those of you, well, I guess, Sean, you're still in Binghamton. And Carole, you're still in San Francisco. Dany, you're somewhere else. Could you do this now where you live now?
It might be coming up. I'm in Hayward, California, which is just south of Oakland. Right. And I've been here 15 years. So I thought, well, I might want to start getting involved. So I've been considering approaching the city council, because we have a very progressive city council here now, and talking to them about this. The other thing is I'm also involved, and I missed a chat because I was preparing for this one today, with a group that is trying to add relationship status, not necessarily, I think, or format. They're looking at different words for covering basically, whether you're married or not, but also whether you're polyamory, whether you have, you're a triad, all of these other relationship styles. And because the way I think, if I'm going to add that anywhere, I'm going to look at what else do we need to add there. And most places still don't have height and weight. The state of California still doesn't have it.
Right.
And I spoke at the San Francisco one, and I'm kind of sad that we haven't done anything since. That we should be adding a lot more places.
Well, and some of the places that do have protections actually have much more limited protections than some of the places where you all worked.
Yeah.
I know that I was recently involved in a conversation online where NAAFA has a fact sheet on our website for those of you who are interested that lists the handful of other places in the United States that have protections. One of those places is Washington, D.C. And I mentioned that, and I linked to that fact sheet, and someone who lives in Maryland wrote a pretty comprehensive response explaining all of the loopholes to that in Washington, D.C., and all of the ways that, employers could get around the employment protection, and it really only was employment protection in Washington, D.C. And so even in some of the places where there are ordinance on the books, they're much more limited than some of the ones that you all worked on. Sandra Salve, who I think a couple of you actually mentioned, is here with us today and would actually like to make a comment about the work in San Francisco. So we're just going to unmute Sandra and.
Do we have a video?
Give me 1 second.
Great. Can you hear me?
Yes. Sandra, thank you for joining us.
Oh, this is such a pleasure. Thank you to all the speakers and organizers, first of all, because it is just so heartwarming to hear these stories, and I'm learning things I didn't even know before. So I really appreciate everyone's time. I wanted to add in about the San Francisco hearing. One of the important things that we did was we really helped people understand the connections between weight discrimination and discrimination based on race. That is something that is incredibly important and
Yes.
not necessarily very well understood. So we had people specifically talking. We had Dr. Elena Escalera actually presenting on the intersection between race, ethnicity, and weight discrimination, and how specifically not protecting weight can make this legal loophole where you're really discriminating based on race, but you're kind of covering it as weight discrimination, and so it looks, it hides the actual intention there. So that was just a really important piece as we think about intersectionality, to keep that in mind. And part of the reason that we were thinking about that is because we were seeing so many of the people who were actually dealing with discrimination issues were coming from African American or Latinx community. So I think that we knew as a community, like a long time ago, that was important piece of the legislation, that we make sure we close those legal loopholes. And the other thing that was cool in San Francisco is that we're able to do these enforcement guidelines, or to help with that. So San Francisco has this additional document that gives examples, that literally says, like with the full force of law, that one size does not fit all, and gives very helpful examples across the board, not just with employment, but also with accommodations, being able to get things that fit how you're treated in medical offices. So just wanted to add that, and thanks again for all of this really amazing commentary.
Thank you for joining us, Sandra, and thank you for sharing all of those thoughts. some of you will know that we have really been working in the last year in particular, leading up to our 50th anniversary conference and then building from there, in really looking at intersectionality in FAT community and making that a priority for NAAFA. And part of intersectionality really is looking at systems, not just looking at individual experiences, but looking at systems. And so thinking about legal discrimination and how intersectionality affects us there is really important. And so thank you, Sandra, for bringing that piece up here. So I'm gonna look, I just wanna make sure we do have some time to get questions from the chat. So.
Oop, we lost her.
We lost Tigress.
There she is.
We have time for just a couple more questions. So there is one question, anonymous question from the chat. Where do you even start working on this? Especially, where do you start working on this if you are in a red state, or even if you're in a blue city within a red state? Where, like, how do you get started?
I think that Carole's comment earlier about don't assume that people won't be on your side. That first talk that I went to at the state conference for now, I came in there, you saw the picture, I'm tiny, I was very tiny. And the first thing the presentation said, "Why are you here?" I'm like, you don't think size discrimination doesn't attack me too? You know, my mother is held up to me as this horror show. You could become like her. You know, that it's used against thin women to try to keep them there. And in that case, what I didn't tell people then is that I was also anorexic at that time. So, you know, you don't always know what somebody's battling with, and everybody has a family member. And same thing, we found that out in LGBTQ stuff. You know, you don't know that person doesn't have a child or somebody they love in their life. And so starting with those connections is where I would start, with who else in the community can you approach on this?
I would just say that it's also good to kind of know the political landscape where you are, whether it's organizations like in our community. I'm in rural upstate New York. I mean, it's like really conservative, but you know, but we have Citizen Action, which is a group, and the Working Families Party, and they're a progressive organization working within this fairly conservative part of upstate New York. And you know, if you can find those folks, you know, and connect with them, you know, those are then allies who can help you figure out how to navigate the political landscape in your community. It's also really important, I think, to build relationships with your local council people, especially if you're in a blue community within a red state. You know who they are. A lot of folk, I realized, you know, when I was on council, that most people don't have a clue about how any of this happens. You know, so I think it's really important to you know, connect and know who the decision makers are, you know, and how, who could possibly get this done, and build a relationship with them as well. Those are some tips.
And one of the things that I see that's the same between all three of us is that we were active in local organizations. And that's, you know, if somebody just comes up from the blue and says, I want to do this, what do I do? You know, that's the first thing I'd say. What kind of an organization would you like to become involved in that you think would help? And you don't just go in and say, I want this passed. You go in and say, what can I do? I want to join this organization. I want to be an active part of it, because you're going to ask them to do that for you. But first you have to pay your dues.
I was going to add that, you know, there's that thing of, you know, if you're going to ask for help in the community, you should be giving help too, and not just on your issue. You know, have you been showing up at their rallies? Have you talked to them about their issues?
Exactly.
The fact that we also did, you know, Take Back the Night rallies and all these other types of activities in the community. Also, don't forget the journalists. I was a journalist. That's why I knew all the city council members. I had to go and report on them all the time because I was low end of that totem pole as far as journalism goes. But because I knew most of the journalists in the area, we got constant coverage of everything we were doing. Sometimes that was difficult, because it meant you had more spotlight. But it did mean that we got it out there that what we were doing was important.
It's really key. We had a similar thing, that building relationships with journalists was really key to our success too. Absolutely, we got good coverage. The other thing that I would throw in there is that, like you Dany and Carole, you did your work. I know, Dany, you said it was in the 80s that you
1990.
1990. Okay.
Before we had it, like, we got challenged about the gender stuff because nobody'd heard of it before.
Right. And so the other thing to remember is that you may not be the first person to try to do this in your community, you know, so even if it failed when the first folks were doing it, it's certainly worth like knowing the history of any efforts to do this work, because it wasn't around size discrimination, but there certainly were efforts within a local community around trans experience and trans protections, and you know, they weren't successful, but there were certainly efforts being made. So I think that was, you know, a lesson that I learned was, you know, know your local history of advocacy.
I will also say to the person that asked this question and to everybody who's thinking about these things, NAAFA is working on a toolkit for tips, you know, more wisdom from these folks and from folks in other places who have helped pass these kinds of laws, resources. We are thinking through how to work on some sort of database or some sort of apparatus for helping connect people who want to do this work in various communities so that they can be resources to each other. We are doing some outreach to other organizations to think about how we can support each other in thinking through these things, in taking action on these things. So, you know, if you read the workshop description for this, some of the thought that our board had about this being particularly important work right now because of some of those intersectional issues that Sandra brought up, and how the pandemic is affecting particularly people of color and low-income communities and disabled communities and elderly populations in ways that these same size discrimination things can affect those communities, and having additional protections for exactly those reasons. I mean, we also know that it can be a difficult time to act on anything else without people just being like, but no, we have to focus only on the pandemic. But we still feel like it's important to be spending some time right now thinking about these kinds of protections. And so as an organization, NAAFA is also moving thinking about legislation back to the forefront as an organization. So we will be developing some more tools and some more support for folks who want to kind of take on these kind of things. So you can look to, again, if you're not a member, if you just want to sign up for our newsletter or follow us on social media, certainly if you want to become a member or are already a member and this is something you're interested in working on, you are welcome to reach out to any member of the NAAFA board. I'm the community outreach director. I'm the easiest one to find probably because there's not another tigress on the NAAFA board. But our board chair, Darlene Howell, is also easy to find. Our publicity chair, Peggy Howell. So, and we have several new board members coming on soon as well. So we are all accessible. You can reach out to any of us if this is something that we can help you get started with in your local community. And we're thinking about what to do in our own local communities as well. So, so NAAFA is a resource for you if this is something that you are thinking about doing. And I am in a bluish city in a very red state. I'm in Chandler, Arizona. So for the person that asked that question, I'm with you. Do we have other questions? I can take one more question from the chat. I don't see another one there yet, but if anyone has a final question, I do see a thought from our publicity chair, Peggy Howell, who just mentions that, again, you know, having connections that a friend in the Democratic Party was connected to legislatures, and that was one of the ways that they were able to do some work around legislative issues. So again, networking and connections, being able to put folks together who might be in the right places to get some help. Go ahead.
I was saying also educate yourself on the issues. Right now, you should be reading up on incarceration of Black people, and looking at, if you're going to work in civil rights, don't limit yourself just to the one that brought you to the table.
Right.
And educate yourself on the issues. Like, sure, you have a great story and that'll be important, but you should also know that it's not just your story and how it affects other people. And so, if you're a reader, read. If you're like me, I have trouble with reading text these days, but audiobooks online at your local library, you can get them free. So the point is that you can learn about the stuff, and it will help you better understand ways to talk to people about their issues.
So, question from the chat. Two questions from the chat. One is about when all of these ordinances were passed, and you can find all that information on the NAAFA fact sheet. It's under, I think it's under the Learn More tab on NAAFA.org. It will include these 3 ordinances and the other cities, and then the other cities across the U.S. that have ordinances. And then the other question is, how hard is it to prove discrimination? For folks who are trying to use these ordinances or these laws to prove that they were discriminated against and to take action, how hard is that?
Look at social science. There's been a lot. There's so many studies. It's huge at this point. You find out somebody who knows how to look up research articles, and you get copies, and you can get the stats. And I'm sure NAAFA has plenty of that. When I was doing, one of the first things I did when I worked as a research chair was start looking through all the news clips that we had and looking for information about what cases were going on, what legal cases were going on throughout the country.
And also that Sandy mentioned the how-to for after it was passed is very important.
Yes.
It's almost like okay, this is the issue, this is how you do it. Yay, Sandy.
I mean, all I can say is that the social science research, I think demonstrating that prejudice and discrimination and harm exists is a lot easier than winning a court case.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just a sad fact. So.
and doing it in multiple ways, like we were able to show that there's an actual how much people are getting paid is different based on their weight, things like that, and just citing those studies. And like I said, if you can give a handout to the people you're working on that shows that stuff, it'll help.
Mm-hmm.
So I will close with the question. I always close allow our webinar guests to have this final thought. Is there something we didn't ask you about today that we should have asked you about? That that you really think we need to know about this subject that we didn't ask you, that I didn't ask you, or our chatters didn't ask you today? And I guess we'll go in the same order. Dany, let's start with you.
I would say that if people are worried about the legalese, it's actually easier to understand than you think. You just get there. In fact, most ordinances will have a list of what the terms mean right there in the text. There'll be a section. So you don't be afraid that, oh my God, I don't know anything about the law. And usually you can find also people who do know the law well in your community who are willing to help advise you.
And Dany, if people want to find you online, are you a public figure? Are there places people can and should follow you?
Well, if you're wanting me as a writer, there's 2 different names I'd write under at the moment. I have my old name, which is Dawn Atkins, which if you're interested in where this LGBT issues affect body image and discrimination, I'm the editor of a book called Looking Queer, which is now getting a little on there in years too, but it's still very applicable. And I also write some fiction under the name DM Atkins. So there's Facebooks in both names.
Great, thank you. Carole, is there something we didn't ask you that we should have asked you?
No, but this is the 20th anniversary of the passing of this, which is really wonderful this year. But next year is the 50th anniversary of the May Day demonstrations that I broke my teeth on in Washington, D.C. And if anybody's interested in there was a webinar just the other night of a guy who just wrote a book about it. And he talks about the way people organized and got people to do things. If you're interested in seeing it, give me send me an email, and I'll send you a copy or send you a link to it. And it's carolecullum@gmail.com.
Thank you. And is there any place else you want people to be able to find you online?
Oh, you can find me on Instagram. I just joined Instagram. I love it.
Great. And are you also Carole Cullum
I'm
on
on
there?
Facebook, but I tend not to go on Facebook that much. I get really depressed.
Yeah.
Are you?
And I don't get depressed on Instagram.
What's your Instagram handle, Carole? Is it also Carole Cullum?
Carole Cullum.
Okay, great. Thank you. Sean, anything we should?
I'm going to cheat and just say that I think I'm going to reiterate the point about, coalition building really is important, and do it. And I keep trying to do it and make it part of my sort of life as much as I can. You have to tend to these relationships too. They don't, stay, you have to keep working them and nurturing them. Please feel free to reach out. I posted, there's my faculty page, I guess it's the best place to put it. You can find me on the Evil Facebook. I'm there a lot, so that's fine as well. And yeah, so this has been really fun. So thanks for inviting me.
And if you're watching, for folks who will be watching this later on YouTube, your faculty pages, remind them what university?
Oh, Binghamton University in the Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies program. And it's WGSS, so you can Google Binghamton WGSS, pops up.
Great. Thank you. Well, thank you all for joining us. And again, I'm Tigress Osborne. I'm NAAFA's Director of Community Outreach. You can find NAAFA online at naafa.org. We just, within the last few weeks, released a new look to our website, and many thank yous to all of the folks who worked on that, particularly our board chair, Darlene Howell, who did the lion's share of the labor on updating that website for us. Please do check it out, give us your feedback, follow us online and on your favorite social media sites. We are on YouTube, we are on Facebook, we are on Instagram, we are on Twitter. And we will be continuing to increase our presence on all of those things. If you want to see this again, or you want to share it with friends, it will be available on YouTube within the next couple of days. And we will also have an English language transcript available soon. Thank you all for being here. We're going to end the recording now. If you would like, for those of you who are here with us live now, after we end the recording, if you'd like to say hello, you are welcome to do that. Thank you once again to all of our panelists for being with us today and sharing this wisdom. Take care, everybody. We'll see you.